Beneath the flickering neon lights of an auction house that smelled of desperation and machinery, a woman sat shackled, her pale violet skin glowing faintly under the harsh glare. She was used to being called worthless, a mistake no one wanted to fix, until the day a scruffy human in patched-up clothes sauntered in and bought her freedom for 150 credits. But as they escaped into the chaos of the galaxy aboard a ship held together by duct tape and defiance, she began to wonder, had he saved her, or dragged her into something far more dangerous? And what did it mean when he looked at her not as a thing to be owned, but as someone with a choice? The auction house was a cacophony of sensations, a place where the air itself seemed to throb with the weight of desperation and human, or rather, sentient, suffering. The scent of oil clung heavily to every surface, mingling with the sharp tang of sweat that rose from the crowd like an invisible fog. It wasn't just the smell of labor or exertion, it was the unmistakable odor of fear, of lives teetering on the edge of uncertainty. Beneath it all, the faint metallic tang of machinery hummed in the background, its rhythmic whirring punctuated by the occasional clank of a faulty ventilation system. The sound reverberated through the space, each metallic echo feeling like a hammer striking an anvil, keeping time with the auctioneer's relentless voice as it barked out numbers. The room was packed, a chaotic tapestry of beings from across the galaxy. Species of all shapes and sizes pressed together under flickering neon lights, their forms casting strange shadows that danced against the walls. Some stood tall, their many-limbed bodies draped in shimmering fabrics that caught the light, while others hunched low, their features obscured by hoods or masks. Despite their differences, they shared a common purpose: to buy and sell lives. This was no ordinary marketplace, it was a grim exchange, where sentient beings were reduced to commodities, their worth measured in credits and utility. The energy barriers dividing the crowd from the merchandise crackled faintly, a reminder of the power dynamics at play. Behind those barriers, individuals stood frozen in silence, their faces a mosaic of emotions: resignation, defiance, hopelessness, and even a flicker of pride. Some had already given up, their eyes vacant, staring into nothingness as though they had accepted their fate. Others strained against the oppressive atmosphere, flexing muscles or standing unnaturally rigid, attempting to project an air of value. They blinked their multiple eyes slowly, enticingly, hoping to catch the attention of a buyer who might see them as more than just another asset in a long line of failures. Among this sea of despair sat one figure whose presence seemed to defy the very essence of the auction. She was small, almost unassuming, her pale violet skin tinged with a faint silvery sheen under the harsh overhead lights. Her posture was relaxed but deliberate, ankles crossed and wrists resting loosely in her lap. A collar encircled her throat, humming softly with the same energy that pulsed through the restraints binding her ankles. It was a cruel symbol of her status, an object, not a person. Yet, there was something about her demeanor that set her apart. While others tried too hard to prove their worth, she carried herself with quiet indifference, as if she had long since stopped caring what anyone thought of her. Her journey to this moment had been fraught with betrayal and disappointment. Dragged across the stars by those who claimed to own her, she had endured countless attempts to sell her off for a profit. Each failure only deepened the disdain of her captors, who muttered bitterly about her lack of value. Too fragile for physical labor, too unpredictable for pleasure markets, and far too proud to beg, she had become a burden passed from owner to owner, unwanted and unloved. To them, she was a mistake, a broken tool no one wanted to fix. And tonight, it seemed, the cycle would repeat itself once more. As the auctioneer hesitated over his next announcement, scanning his screen with visible disinterest, the tension in the room grew palpable. The crowd leaned forward, their collective curiosity piqued by the promise of something novel, even if it turned out to be yet another disappointment. When the barrier around her finally flickered and dropped, revealing her to the assembled buyers, a hush fell over the audience, not one born of awe or admiration, but rather a shared sense of vague dissatisfaction. The murmurs began almost immediately, critiques of her size, her delicate bone structure, the unusual hue of her skin. For many, she represented yet another unsellable item, a relic of someone else's failed investment. Yet, amidst the whispers and dismissive glances, a single voice cut through the din with startling clarity. It wasn't loud or commanding, instead, it carried an almost casual certainty, as if purchasing a sentient being were no different from grabbing a snack from a vending machine. Heads turned in unison, searching for the source of the declaration. What they found was unexpected, a scruffy-looking individual dressed in patched-up clothing, clearly out of place among the polished and calculating crowd. His stance was relaxed, his expression unreadable, as though he had wandered in by accident. But when he spoke again, confirming his intent to buy her, the room erupted into murmurs of disbelief. How could someone so seemingly ordinary step forward to claim such a peculiar prize? And why? In that instant, the narrative shifted. The woman, who had spent years being told she was worthless, found herself the subject of a transaction unlike any other. The stranger's decision to purchase her, for a mere fraction of what most beings went for, was both baffling and profound. As the collar deactivated and the shackles unlocked, she stepped forward haltingly, unsure of what lay ahead. For the first time in what felt like forever, she walked away, not because someone else decided her fate, but because, perhaps, she had finally found someone willing to see her as more than just a number. This expanded version captures the sensory details, emotional depth, and thematic undertones of the original script while reframing it in original language. By focusing on the setting, characters, and pivotal moments, the narrative becomes richer and more immersive, inviting readers to engage with the story on multiple levels. Let me know how you'd like to proceed with further sections. In the dim glow of the auction house, where every shadow seemed to stretch longer with cynicism, the appearance of the stranger was as unexpected as a beam of sunlight breaking through a stormy sky. Dressed in a patchwork jacket that bore the scars of countless repairs and scuffed boots that whispered tales of endless wandering, he looked more suited to the docks than to the polished floors of an interstellar auction. His dark hair stood in rebellious tufts, defying gravity with an ease that suggested either a lack of care or a silent protest against conformity. His jawline was adorned with stubble, uneven and wild, hinting at days spent without the luxury of a razor or perhaps a simple disregard for societal norms. His demeanor was perhaps the most striking aspect of his entrance. There was a casualness to his stance, hands nonchalantly stuffed into his pockets, his body swaying slightly as if to an unheard rhythm. He moved through the crowded room with an effortless ease, weaving between alien species and mechanical beings alike, as though navigating through a familiar alleyway back home. This casual confidence was neither arrogance nor ignorance, rather, it was a comfortable familiarity with chaos, a trait often found in those who have spent enough time on the fringes of society to understand its rhythms and nuances. When the auctioneer called for bids on the lot featuring the enigmatic woman, the stranger's response was immediate yet understated. Unlike the flamboyant gestures or aggressive posturing typical of seasoned buyers, his bid was calm, almost indifferent. It was as if he were selecting a trinket from a market stall, his interest piqued not by the spectacle but by something deeper, something intangible. His voice, when it finally broke the murmurs of the crowd, carried no weight of authority, no slither of greed. Instead, it resonated with a simplicity that was both jarring and refreshing in a place steeped in pretense and manipulation. This approach sparked a wave of reactions throughout the auction floor. Whispers rippled through the gathering like a breeze through tall grass, carrying snippets of disbelief and muted laughter. The auctioneer himself paused, blinking in surprise at the audacity of the bid. Or perhaps the audacity of the bidder. Here was a man who seemed oblivious to the unspoken codes and hierarchies that governed these transactions, a man who dared to challenge the very fabric of expectation simply by existing authentically within it. For the woman, this moment marked a turning point. Used to being scrutinized and dismissed, she watched as the stranger stepped forward, his gaze steady and unwavering. There was no calculation in his eyes, no predatory gleam assessing her potential profitability. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of her as more than just a product to be traded. As the deal was finalized and the gavel slammed down, sealing her fate with this unlikely savior, she felt a shift within herself, a subtle loosening of chains that had bound not just her body but her spirit as well. The stranger's unconventional method of bidding, marked by its simplicity and authenticity, challenged the conventional wisdom of the auction house. In choosing to value her not for her utility or rarity but simply for her existence, he introduced a new dynamic into the stale air of commerce and captivity. This act, seemingly minor in the grand scheme of intergalactic trade, held profound implications for the woman, who found herself stepping into a future defined less by transactions and more by transformation. As they left the auction house together, the woman walking freely for the first time in memory, the seeds of change were sown, not just in her life but potentially in the lives of others who might witness or hear of this extraordinary departure from norm. As the heavy doors of the auction house slid shut behind them, the cacophony of the crowd faded into a distant murmur, replaced by the stark contrast of the bustling spaceport outside. The transition from confinement to freedom was palpable, yet unfamiliar. The woman took tentative steps, her limbs unused to moving without the weight of shackles or the guiding push of a trader's hand. Each breath she drew was a mix of the metallic tang of starship fuel, the acrid bite of burnt rubber, and the indefinable scent of despair that seemed to permeate the very air of the port. Around her, the spaceport buzzed with life, a chaotic swirl of beings and machines. Neon lights flashed in a dizzying array of colors, casting surreal shadows that danced across the worn metal surfaces of docked ships. Vendors shouted over one another, their voices a medley of pitches and languages, offering everything from questionable foodstuff to black market cybernetic parts. The scene was a sensory overload, overwhelming yet oddly liberating after the sterile confines of the auction house. Despite the newfound liberty, the woman's mind grappled with the concept of autonomy. She trailed behind the stranger, who now seemed more guide than captor. He navigated the throng with an ease that suggested he was either deeply accustomed to such environments or blissfully ignorant of the dangers lurking within. His hands remained tucked into his jacket pockets, his stride unhurried and confident. She mirrored his path, her movements a mixture of mimicry and instinct, unsure whether she followed him out of choice or simply due to the absence of any other directive. The internal conflict brewed silently within her. On one hand, there was exhilaration, a bubbling sensation akin to the fizz of carbonated drinks, that came from making decisions, however small. Each step she took independently felt monumental, a testament to her regained agency. Yet, intertwined with this euphoria was a gnawing anxiety. Years of being treated as property had ingrained a sense of dependency. The sudden removal of external control left her adrift, uncertain of her role in this vast, unpredictable cosmos. Her thoughts oscillated between gratitude and skepticism. Gratitude towards the stranger who had, for reasons still unclear, chosen to buy her freedom. Skepticism about his intentions and the reality of her situation. Was this truly freedom, or merely a transfer of ownership cloaked in altruism? The questions swirled, unanswered, in the recesses of her mind, as she continued to tread cautiously in his wake. The spaceport, with its vibrant chaos and underlying currents of danger, served as both a literal and metaphorical backdrop to her internal turmoil. Here, amidst the hustle and bustle of interstellar commerce and survival, she stood on the precipice of a new chapter, one where the lines between captivity and freedom blurred and intertwined. Each step forward was a step into the unknown, laden with potential and peril, as she navigated not just the physical expanse of the spaceport but the complex labyrinth of her own evolving identity. As they approached the vessel that would soon become their refuge, the woman couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. If calling it a ship was generous, describing it as seaworthy would have been laughable. The craft before them was a patchwork of stubbornly connected metal plates, duct tape serving as both sealant and aesthetic. Its hull was rusted, paint peeled away by time and turbulence, and mismatched parts protruded awkwardly, as if the ship had cannibalized scraps from at least 6 different manufacturers. It was clear that whoever had pieced it together had done so with little regard for aerodynamics, or safety. "This is a joke," she muttered under her breath, crossing her arms as she stared at the monstrosity. The stranger chuckled, unfazed by her skepticism. Don't judge, he said lightly, stepping forward and giving the hull an affectionate pat. She's sensitive. No sooner had he touched it than a panel fell off with a metallic clang, landing at his feet. He froze mid-motion, then cleared his throat as if trying to regain composure. She does that sometimes, he offered lamely, scratching the back of his neck. She explodes, the woman quipped dryly, arching an eyebrow. No, no, he replied quickly, waving a dismissive hand. Just, sheds. Like a snake. A snake that looks like it's held together by optimism and denial, she retorted, unable to suppress a smirk despite herself. He grinned, undeterred. Exactly. See? You're catching on. Gesturing toward the ramp with a theatrical flourish, he added, come on, you'll love her. She hesitated, eyeing the ship warily. Love was not a word she associated with anything at the moment, let alone this dubious contraption. Still, there was nowhere else to go, and something about his light-hearted persistence made resistance feel futile. With a resigned sigh, she followed him aboard. Inside, the chaos continued. The cockpit resembled a graveyard for dismantled consoles, wires spilling out like entrails onto the floor. One chair was held together by zip ties and what appeared to be sheer willpower, its cushions sagging ominously beneath the weight of past occupants. Notes scrawled across the walls ranged from technical reminders, do not press the red button, to cryptic musings, why does my coffee always taste like regret? It was cluttered, chaotic, and utterly devoid of any semblance of order, but strangely, it also felt alive. As they settled in, a disembodied voice crackled through the speakers. Welcome back, Captain Rick. You have 14 overdue payments, a warranty that expired 6 years ago, and a cargo hold full of regrets. The stranger, Rick, rolled his eyes. Yeah, I missed you too, Bite. Bite? The woman echoed, looking around as if expecting some unseen entity to materialize. That's our AI, Rick explained, jerking a thumb toward the ceiling. She's got opinions. Lots of them. I noticed, she replied dryly, folding her arms. The AI chimed in again, its tone suspiciously cheerful. Oh, you brought a guest. Is she here to kill you, or did you finally hire someone who knows what they're doing? Rick groaned theatrically. Bite, meet Soul. Soul, she repeated, startled. No one had ever given her a name before, at least, not one that wasn't a number or an insult. The word felt foreign on her tongue, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Rick shrugged. Felt right. She opened her mouth to argue, to insist that she didn't need a label, but the words never came. Instead, she found herself hesitating, caught off guard by the odd warmth that bloomed in her chest. Did she like it? She wasn't sure. But she didn't hate it either. Fine, she muttered finally, her voice softer than intended. Soul. The AI whistled approvingly, a sound remarkably human for something supposedly synthetic. Ooh, attitude. This will be fun. Rick clapped his hands together, rubbing them briskly. All right, let's get you settled. We've got, he frowned, glancing around the cramped interior. Well, technically, there's a spare room, but it's full of old ship parts and socks. Why? She asked automatically, though part of her already knew the answer. Rick smirked. Because I refuse to do laundry. Before she could respond, Bite interjected, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. Shut up, Bite, Rick shot back without missing a beat. Soul pinched the bridge of her nose, exhaling slowly. I'm starting to think getting sold for 150 credits wasn't the worst thing that happened to me today. Rick grinned, leaning back against the console. See? You're adjusting already. That night, as the ship groaned and rattled its way through hyperspace, Soul lay on a cot Rick had hastily assembled for her. The patchwork vessel vibrated with every pulse of its engines, a constant reminder of its precarious state. Yet, amidst the noise and instability, there was a surprising sense of comfort. The hum of the engines was soothing, almost rhythmic, and the occasional sarcastic remark from Byte provided a strange sort of companionship. Even Rick's snoring from the cockpit, where he'd forgotten to move to his own bed, added to the bizarre symphony of sounds that lulled her into a restless sleep. It was strange, she thought as she stared at the ceiling. For years, she had slept in cells, storage crates, and the backs of transport ships, all cold, unfamiliar, and temporary. But here, surrounded by chaos and imperfection, she felt warm. Not physically, but emotionally. It wasn't happiness, exactly, more like the absence of emptiness. For the first time in longer than she cared to remember, she didn't feel like nothing. The next morning, as sunlight filtered weakly through the porthole, or what passed for one, Rick appeared with 2 steaming cups of something vaguely resembling coffee. Handing her one, he grinned. Breakfast of champions. She eyed the murky liquid skeptically. Champions of what? Survival, he replied with a wink, taking a hearty sip. We're experts at that. She couldn't help but smile, a small, hesitant curve of her lips, but it was there nonetheless. Maybe this wasn't freedom in the traditional sense. Maybe the rust bucket wasn't much of a ship. But for now, it was hers. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the patched-together vessel known affectionately, or perhaps mockingly, as the rust bucket groaned its way into hyperspace, the peculiarities of its operation became glaringly apparent. The ship's drive rattled with a fervor that sounded suspiciously like someone shaking a can filled with nails, a sound that was both alarming and oddly rhythmic. Sol sat stiffly in the co-pilot's seat, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, as she watched Rick lean back casually, his boots propped up on the dashboard. His relaxed demeanor was a stark contrast to the palpable tension in the air, tension that was thick with the potential for disaster. This is the worst vessel I have ever been inside, Sol muttered, her voice edged with a blend of disbelief and burgeoning panic. Her gaze darted nervously over the myriad of buttons and levers that lined the control panel, none of which seemed particularly stable or trustworthy. Rick didn't even glance up from his position. You get used to her, he said with a nonchalance that bordered on infuriating. I don't want to get used to her. Sol snapped, her voice rising along with her anxiety. I want to survive. At that moment, the ship's AI, Byte, crackled to life, its voice cutting through the tense atmosphere with a chilling statistic. Statically speaking, your odds of survival are roughly 42%. Sol's eyes widened as she processed this information, her fingers tightening involuntarily on the armrests. That's not great, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Byte's tone, however, remained cheerfully upbeat. It's up from last week. Rick smirked, seemingly unfazed by the dire prediction. See? Progress, he remarked, gesturing vaguely with his mug. Sol sighed, resisting the urge to rub her temples in frustration. Where exactly are we going? She asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of dread and curiosity. Cath Station, Rick replied, his tone as casual as if he were announcing a trip to the local market. Sol's brow furrowed at the mention of the station. Cath was notorious, a sprawling trade hub populated by scavengers, mercenaries, and those who carried at least 3 knives and a grudge. It was a place where people disappeared as easily as they arrived, swallowed by the station's labyrinthine alleys and shadowy corners. Rick must have noticed her hesitation, for he tilted his head slightly, his expression questioning. You know it? He asked, his voice softening. It's a terrible idea, she responded flatly, her earlier apprehension morphing into outright concern. Rick stretched, cracking his knuckles with a nonchalant ease that belied the seriousness of their destination. Well, that's where we're headed. We need a new drive coil, and I owe someone there a drink. Sol arched an eyebrow, incredulous. You're risking landing on a station full of cutthroats and thieves, for a drink? Rick shrugged, his grin widening. It's a really good drink. Byte chimed in again, her voice dripping with sarcasm. It's also the only place that hasn't banned him yet. Sol shook her head, a mixture of disbelief and reluctant amusement playing across her features. You are the worst kind of human. Rick's grin only broadened. A fun one. A reckless one. He tapped a few buttons on the console, his focus momentarily shifting. Reckless keeps things interesting. As the rust bucket shuddered and lurched through hyperspace, Sol couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of her situation. Here she was, hurtling through the cosmos in a ship held together by duct tape and sheer willpower, accompanied by a man who seemed to thrive on chaos and an AI that seemed to relish in delivering bad news. Yet, despite the madness, or perhaps because of it, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, a spark of excitement, a taste of adventure. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly unpredictable, a fitting reflection of her new life aboard the rust bucket. The docking bay of Cath Station greeted them with an ambience that was as foreboding as it was chaotic. Dimly lit and slick with substances better left unidentified, the station was a maze of grease-streaked mechanics and shadowy figures, each watching the newcomers with a predatory gleam in their eyes. As Sol followed Rick down the ramp, her senses heightened, every nerve ending alert to the potential threats hidden in the gloom. Her posture was tense, a stark contrast to Rick's relaxed amble, which seemed almost taunting in such a dangerous environment. I feel like I should warn you, Sol began, her voice low and urgent as she glanced around with wary eyes. This is the kind of place where people disappear. Rick waved a dismissive hand, his expression unconcerned. I don't have enough credits to be worth kidnapping. Sol stared at him, her incredulity evident. That is not comforting, she hissed, gripping the railing tightly as they descended fully into the station. Before she could articulate further protests, a deep, gravelly voice boomed out, halting them in their tracks. Well, if it isn't Rick the Unkillable. Turning sharply, Sol found herself face to face with a towering alien, massive and muscular, with skin a deep shade of green and a face marred by jagged scars. His arms were crossed over his expansive chest, and his eyes narrowed as they landed on her, sparking a flicker of recognition. Next, Rick greeted with a wide, exaggerated spread of his arms, his tone jovial despite the ominous presence before them. Still alive? That's great news. Nex did not return the smile. Instead, his gaze hardened, and his voice rumbled like distant thunder. I will kill you. Sol took an involuntary step back, her heart pounding wildly. Rick, however, seemed unfazed. Stepping smoothly between her and Nex, his voice adopted a casual timbre. Small galaxy, huh? You two know each other? Sol's jaw tightened as she addressed Nex directly, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. Not personally. Nex exhaled through his nose, his focus remaining fixed on her. I saw you once, a long time ago. A traitor tried to sell you. His gaze darkened, and he leaned slightly forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. He didn't know what you were. Rick picked up on the escalating tension instantly, squaring his shoulders in a subtle but firm stance that was neither threatening nor submissive. Funny, Rick said, because she's not for sale. Nex's lips curled into a humorless smirk, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling interest. I wonder if you know what you have. Sol's fingers twitched towards the knife Rick had gifted her earlier, her mind racing. She didn't know what she was, nor why Nex suddenly regarded her with such intense curiosity. But one thing was certain, this was no ordinary encounter. Whatever Nex knew, or thought he knew, it spelled danger. Rick, noticing the shift, interjected firmly. Hey, she's not some rare antique you just remembered is worth a fortune. It's creepy. Nex huffed a laugh, a deep rumble that echoed ominously in the confined space. You should be careful, human. You don't know what you're carrying. Rick's eyes narrowed, his tone sharpening. Neither do I, but it's my life. Nex considered her for a moment longer before shrugging dismissively, though his eyes remained calculating. Maybe that's for the best. Rick rocked back on his heels, clapping his hands together in a gesture of forced levity. Well, that was ominous. Time to get off this station before someone else decides to put a bounty on our heads. As they turned to leave, Byte's voice crackled over the comm unit strapped to Rick's wrist. Fun fact, there's already a bounty on your head, Rick. Who? Rick groaned, rolling his eyes. Someone named Kel the Butcher, Byte replied cheerfully. Sol blinked, her unease mounting. The Butcher? Rick sighed heavily, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I may have accidentally sold him fake reactor fuel last year. Sol rubbed her temples, her frustration boiling over. You are actually the worst. We need to leave, Rick agreed, urgency creeping into his voice as they hurried back towards the rust bucket. The ship shook violently as they pulled away from Kath Station, its engines protesting loudly. Byte's voice chimed in again, her tone annoyingly chipper. Are we leaking atmosphere? Not yet, Byte replied, but I'd say there's a 70% chance we explode before dinner. Sol tightened the straps on her harness, her grip white-knuckled. You fly like a drunk asteroid. Hey, I get us where we need to go, Rick shot back, his grin irrepressible even in the face of impending doom. Barely. As the rust bucket jerked to the left, clearing the station's gravitational pull, Sol exhaled deeply, her body relaxing incrementally as they drifted safely into the void of space. Hours later, as the hum of the engines lulled them into a semblance of calm, Sol sat across from Rick in the tiny, cluttered dining area, a half-full cup of questionable liquid cradled in her hands. She wasn't sure what it was, only that Rick had handed it to her with the advice, don't ask what's in it, just drink it. So, Rick began, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the table, you want to talk about what that was back there? Sol hesitated, considering lying or brushing it off. But the truth had been clawing at her mind since Nex had looked at her with something other than indifference. Finally, she admitted in a voice quieter than she intended, I don't know what I am. But I know I was never supposed to exist. Rick didn't flinch, didn't react with shock or horror. He simply nodded, as if she had commented on the weather forecast. Yeah, he said, sipping from his own cup. And? She blinked, taken aback by his nonchalance. And, that doesn't bother you? Why would it? Rick replied, setting his cup down with a soft thunk. Look, Sol, I don't know what Nex meant. Maybe you're some lost experiment, maybe secret royalty, or maybe a time-traveling space ghost. He smirked, clearly amused by his own absurd suggestion. That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, she retorted, though a reluctant smile tugged at her lips. See? You're fitting in already, Rick teased, his grin widening. Sol sighed, feeling a strange warmth bloom in her chest despite herself. She had spent years being dragged from one trader to another, being told she was worthless, unwanted, a mistake. Now, sitting on a half-broken ship with a reckless human who cracked dumb jokes, she realized something profound. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting to be sold or for someone else to decide her fate. She was here because she wanted to be. Rick stretched, yawning loudly. Well, I say we celebrate not dying by getting some sleep. Sol rolled her eyes, though her tone was lighter. Your bar for celebration is very low. Try living with a homicidal AI and a ship held together by spite, Rick countered, grinning. Byte's voice cut in, indignant. I heard that. Good night, Byte, Rick called out, ignoring the AI's protest. I hope your bed collapses. Sol let out a breathless chuckle, standing as she made her way toward her quarters. Pausing in the doorway, she glanced back at Rick, her expression softening. She opened her mouth, wanting to thank him, to acknowledge what he had done. Instead, she settled for a teasing remark. The rust bucket is still a piece of junk. Rick smirked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Yeah, but she's our piece of junk. Sol rolled her eyes, shaking her head as she disappeared down the hall. For once, she wasn't a thing to be owned, a mistake to be discarded. She was Soul, and for now, that was enough. In the heart of the cosmos, aboard a vessel that was as much a character as its crew, the revelations began to unfold. The confrontation with Nex at Kath Station had stirred not only the waters of immediate danger but also the depths of Soul's own mysterious origins. It was during one of their quieter moments, nestled in the cluttered confines of the Rust Bucket's dining area, that Rick broached the subject with a casualness that belied its gravity. "So, you want to talk about what was back there?" Rick tapped his fingers on the table, his eyes meeting Soul's with an openness that invited honesty. Soul hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. The encounter with Nex had unearthed feelings and memories buried deep within her, fragments of a past she had no recollection of, yet felt intrinsically connected to. "I don't know what I am," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The confession hung heavy in the air, a cloud of uncertainty that Rick met with a nod. "Yeah," he said simply, sipping from his own cup as if she had just mentioned the weather. His nonchalance was a balm to her raw nerves. And that doesn't bother you?" Soul looked at him, searching for any sign of the revulsion or fear she had grown accustomed to seeing in others. "Why would it?" Rick replied, setting his cup down with a soft thunk. His gaze was steady, sincere. "Look, Soul, I don't know what Nex meant. Maybe you're some lost experiment, maybe secret royalty, or maybe, I dunno, a time-traveling space ghost." He smirked, attempting to lighten the mood. "That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard," Soul shot back, though a reluctant smile tugged at her lips. The absurdity of his suggestion was oddly comforting, a reminder that not everything had to be taken so seriously. "See? You're fitting in already," Rick teased, his grin widening. His ability to find humor in the darkest situations was infectious, and Soul found herself laughing softly, a sound that felt foreign yet freeing. Soul sighed, her smile fading as she pondered her existence. She had spent years being told she was worthless, unwanted, a mistake. Now, sitting on a half-broken ship with a reckless human who cracked dumb jokes, she realized something profound. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting to be sold or for someone else to decide her fate. She was here because she wanted to be. Rick stretched, yawning loudly. "Well, I say we celebrate not dying by getting some sleep." Soul rolled her eyes, though her tone was lighter. "Your bar for celebration is very low. Try living with a homicidal AI and a ship held together by spite," Rick countered, grinning. Bite's voice cut in, indignant. "I heard that." "Good night, Bite," Rick called out, ignoring the AI's protest. "I hope your bed collapses." Soul let out a breathless chuckle, standing as she made her way toward her quarters. Pausing in the doorway, she glanced back at Rick, her expression softening. She opened her mouth, wanting to thank him, to acknowledge what he had done. Instead, she settled for a teasing remark. "The Rust Bucket is still a piece of junk." Rick smirked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Yeah, but she's our piece of junk." Soul rolled her eyes, shaking her head as she disappeared down the hall. For once, she wasn't a thing to be owned, a mistake to be discarded. She was Soul, and for now, that was enough. The journey through the stars continued, each day bringing new challenges and revelations. The Rust Bucket, with all its quirks and flaws, became a sanctuary, a place where Soul could explore her identity without judgment. Rick's unwavering support and quirky outlook on life provided a foundation upon which she could rebuild her sense of self. Together, they navigated the complexities of her past, unraveling the threads of mystery that had bound her for so long. As they ventured further into the unknown, Soul began to embrace the uncertainties of her existence. She learned to find strength in vulnerability, to see beauty in imperfection, and to cherish the connections that transcended the boundaries of species and circumstance. In the end, it wasn't about finding all the answers but about discovering the courage to keep asking questions, to keep moving forward, and to keep believing in the possibility of something more. And so, aboard the rust bucket, amidst the chaos of hyperspace and the unpredictability of life, Soul found not only a home but a purpose. She was no longer defined by her past or the perceptions of others. She was simply Soul, navigating the stars with a ragtag crew that had become her family. And in that realization, she found peace, a peace that was as vast and infinite as the universe itself.